All right, well, if you can't hear me, raise your hand and, okay, perfect, thank you. I'm Rebecca Church. I'm the Global Biodiversity Stewardship Lead at WWF, and today we are bringing together a fantastic group of speakers to discuss the role of the private sector in contributing to the expansion and management of protected and conserved areas. We know that the private sector will play a critical role in helping to achieve global protected areas goals, but the question is really how can corporates start to understand their relationship with protected areas and the risks and opportunities that they might face in relation to that. So today we'll start out with a presentation from Mariana Napolitano Ferreira from WWF Brazil on threats to protected areas and the role of the private sector. Then you'll hear from Maria Walsh, who's our biodiversity risk filter manager, and myself from WWF Germany on approaches to biodiversity risk and opportunity analysis for corporates. And finally, we'll conclude with a panel discussion featuring Alexander David from Lidl, Alice Rueza, WWF Africa's Regional Director, and Jamie McCallum from Force for Nature. Our plan is to leave a short portion at the end for questions from the audience. But first up, we have Mariana joining us remotely from Brazil via Teams. And hopefully we can get Mariana up here now.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'll share my screen. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you all today. Just give me a second. Okay, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. So I will give you a brief overview, as Rebecca mentioned, on the threats to protected and conserved areas and the role of the private sector. And I'm based here in São Paulo, in Brazil. And yesterday it was Amazon Day here for us, so an important moment also to celebrate our protected areas. As you all know, there are currently more than 238,000 protected areas across the globe, and this number is expected to increase, especially with the incorporation and recognition of conserved areas. Terrestrial protected areas cover more than 20 million square kilometers, almost 50% of the Earth's land, while marine protected areas cover more than 6 million square kilometers, which covers around 7% of the world's ocean. Increasingly, new protected areas are established not only to protect iconic species and landscapes, but also to serve a range of other functions, such as enhancing local livelihoods, improving fishery stocks, increasing carbon sequestration, and helping people adapt to the impacts of climate change. Protected and conserved areas play a critical role in achieving not only CBD targets, but also UNFCCC, so many protected areas are recognized and contributing to NDCs and SDGs. Moreover, with the COVID pandemic, protected and conserved areas have gained a new and important role by diminishing the risk of future zoonotic diseases emerging.
Mariana?
They are one of the best and cost-effective nature-based solutions. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. You might want to put your presentation just on full screen so we can see you go through the deck.
It is on full screen.
Oh, okay.
For me.
Well, we only see the cover slide. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, proceed.
Great. Oh, no, that's great. Let me try to share through the PDF and see if it goes better.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, thank you. Okay,
Looks
I will
good.
change the slides so to see.
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay,
Looks good.
so I'll just skip those initial slides as I was talking about the coverage of protected areas, their value, and how they are important to CBD, UNFCCC, and SDGs. Also, the frequency of new zoonotic diseases emerging and the role of protected areas in avoiding new diseases. And I was here talking about how they are one of the best and cost-effective nature-based solutions against future land use change, species extinction, new pandemics, and climate change. I hope you can see my slides changing right now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
And here are some quotes. Okay, great. Here are some quotes reaffirming the value of protected areas, and by Dr. Bruno Bell. Dr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, all saying about the value of protected areas for us to build back better, and Ms. Marion Robinson. However, while we have extensive information, examples, and studies confirming the key role of these areas, they are, especially in high biodiversity areas, such as this beautiful protected area in the Brazilian savanna, they are mostly underfunded, threatened, and completely alienated from governmental and sectorial plans. On balance, post-COVID economic stimulus packages and policies to date have undermined more than supported environmental protections. While there are some positive examples of economic recovery package really benefiting protected areas or scaling up environmental protections, there are also more than 60 cases in 22 countries where protections measures have been rolled back in favor of development. In a perverse cycle, we watch in many iconic places protected and conserved areas suffering from encroachment, invasion, illegal activities, fire, and the conversion of their natural habitats. Here in Brazil, for example, deforestation in Amazon protected areas increased by 40% only from 2018 to 2019. Finally, as an extreme process of increasing threats to protected areas, we have been observing in the last 2 decades a significant advance on the frequency of PAD events, downgrade, downsize, and degazettement. These are all legal changes to protected areas that compromise their conservation status. Between 1892 and 2020, 74 countries enacted more than 4,400 PAD events, affecting an area nearly the size of India. Between 1944 and 2019, 26 countries proposed additionally 1,100 PAD events that were not enacted. Most of the enacted PAD, and this is the distribution of the PAD events, the PAD tracker website, and a partnership from Conservation International and WWF. Most of the enacted PAD events globally are related to industrial scale resource extraction and development, including infrastructure, industrial agriculture, oil, gas, and mining. United States and Brazil are the emerging hotspots of PAD. In Brazil, we already lost more than 11 million hectares of protected areas, an area the size of Bulgaria. Finally, I should also mention the important role of the private sector to support the consolidation and minimize threats to protected areas. Companies have been increasingly engaged in supported PA-related initiatives. And as an example, I can mention the ARPA program, the largest tropical forest conservation program in the world, supporting more than 60 million hectares of protected areas in the Brazilian Amazon, with support and significant support from companies and from the private sector. And I'm sure that, like ARPA, we have many other examples. However, if we are to change the status quo, we need to go beyond. Protected areas must be fully acknowledged and mainstreamed into the business of the companies, either as a risk or, in many cases, as an opportunity too. Just to give you an example, more than 40% of the production capacity of hydroelectricity in operation in Brazil is under the influence of protected areas, which is a huge opportunity. But at the same time, we have a recent PAD that eliminated the protection of 2,000 square kilometers area in the Amazon, making more than 200,000 cattle legal for big sector now. So this is the original area when this protected area was established, and all the area except the white one was converted into cattle pasture, and now the area was downgraded, downsized. So now all the cattle inside this area is legal and can be commercialized in everywhere here in Brazil. So just to mention some of the things that the private sector can do, I bring here the asks of a World Conservation Congress motion already approved, that WWF, CI, and other NGOs co-authored. And we are asking governments, IUCN members, and others, and here I highlight some of the things that are important for the private sector, to acknowledge the risks that unrestrained and poorly governed PAD poses to biodiversity and geodiversity, to refrain from enacting PAD, refrain from enacting, conducting, and investing or funding PAD that will lead to industrial activities and infrastructure development, or industrial activities and infrastructure development that, in the end, will lead to PAD. Also, to mobilize adequate and predictable financial and technical resources to enhance protected area permanence and monitoring to manage protected areas more comprehensively and in compliance with their primary objective. This is an example of the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is a collaborative effort to establish common definitions and good practices and for supply chain commitments. And PAD is included in the core principles. And what they say is that companies and producers can play a significant role to avoid new events of PAD if they commit not to source from areas that were previously protected. And to finalize, expanding and consolidating protected and conserved area systems is an affordable and sensible insurance policy against deforestation, climate change, and future pandemics. And private sector commitments are a key part of these strategies to reduce pressure that lead to PAD and other threats to protected and conserved areas. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Mariana. I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions for you, so if you are able to stick with us until the end of the session, that would be fantastic. Next up, Maria and I will be chatting about biodiversity risk and opportunity analysis. If we could switch over to the presentation on this laptop, that would be great. So in order for corporates to take a more strategic approach to including protected areas in their sustainability strategies, we think it's really important to foster a good understanding of the risks and the opportunities that they may have when interfacing with protected areas. So we're all very, very aware of the disastrous decline in species and ecosystems around the world. It's the reason we're all here today. But I think one of the pieces that has been missing until recently is a more mainstream and widespread recognition of the economic risks that are associated with this decline, creating risk not only for overall economic stability, but also for individual corporations themselves. And I think in large part, it's really the growing focus on corporate climate risk that's really propelled awareness of environmental risks to the forefront of the private sector. And now we're finally starting to see this awareness starting to extend to biodiversity-related risks and opportunities as well. Not exclusively, but in large part, this is really because of increasing pressure and scrutiny from a variety of important stakeholders, whether that's customers or employees or investors and regulators. And as a result of this, we're really starting to see a proliferation of both voluntary and mandatory frameworks, like science-based targets for nature, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, new forthcoming requirements under CDP and GRI, the EU Taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and I could probably list about 15 more. But many companies are really starting to struggle to understand how to meet these new expectations because biodiversity is such a complex topic with so many different factors that go into it. So very simply, how should companies start to think about biodiversity risk? In short, it's driven by the ways that they both impact and depend on biodiversity, as well as the state of biodiversity health in either the locations that they're operating in or the regions that they're sourcing from. And companies really need to be able to understand these risks within the existing context of their corporate risk management frameworks. And here we see that the TCFD's approach to climate risk actually translates very, very well to biodiversity risk. So if we were to create a corporate risk taxonomy in terms of biodiversity risk, we might think of it in terms of physical risk. So this is really driven by the way that companies depend on biodiversity. Here, businesses might face cost increases or a loss of revenue arising from the decline of ecosystem services that they rely on. They might face regulatory risk in relation to their impacts on biodiversity. So this can be a risk of fines or prosecution or a loss of license to operate as a result of either existing laws or future laws and regulations. Critically, many companies are facing reputation risk from environmental and social impacts. This can result in a loss of brand value or revenue loss from either perceived or actual misconduct in the eyes of stakeholders. And finally, companies might be facing market risk stemming from both impacts and dependencies on biodiversity, but this can really result in cost increases for them or a loss of revenue due to changing market dynamics such as shifting consumer sentiments. And we do see these risks materialize all the time in relation to protected and conserved areas. So on the physical risk side of things, we know that protected areas often help maintain the very ecosystem services that companies are depending on. So a great example is watershed protection and the ongoing maintenance of water quality and quantity. On regulatory risk, we see that companies lose their license to operate sometimes in areas that become subject to new protective measures, or they can face fines or prosecution for impacts on protected areas. On reputation risk, companies face serious reputational fallout if their operations or their suppliers negatively impact protected areas. And on market risk, this is an interesting one here, and what we really see very frequently is reduced access to capital. A lot of financial institutions now specifically prohibit financing any activities that adversely impact protected areas or take place within protected areas. And so companies that don't manage these impacts well may be at a disadvantage in terms of accessing financing in comparison to their competitors. And from here, I will hand it over to Maria to talk about the positive side of things, opportunities and risk analysis.
Thank you, Rebecca. So after talking all of these different risks that corporates might face when interacting with nature, we would be remiss to not also mention all the opportunities that can come up when there's a positive interaction between a corporate and nature, and especially protected areas. What do I mean when I say positive interaction with protected areas? Obviously, if it's already existing, if there's an existing protected areas, there could be enhanced protection or just the securing of said protection. Or if there's areas that are not yet under protection but are of high conservation value, it is important that corporates also invest in increasing the connectivity between those, restore them, or get them to actually reach that protection level. When they invest in this kind of positive interaction with nature, there's a win-win case between nature and corporates created. A lot of incentives can be reached through that, ranging from things like tax advantages over ESG stories, that increase the brand values, all the way to improved relationships with local communities. Now, we are currently building a biodiversity risk filter that is thinking exactly about bringing corporates on that journey to be in a more biodiversity positive environment. And we are trying to break down this very complicated interplay between nature and corporations to mainly three phases that are characterized by these three questions that you see here. It really all starts with awareness raising, the question of why to act. It is all about a company understanding what is my interaction with biodiversity, with nature, with protected areas, what are the kinds of impacts that I have on nature, but also the dependencies that they have, that the company has, or even the entire sector. And when one has that intrinsic motivation to change something about that, because one understands that it is very important, one can move over to the question of where to act. The question of protected areas, as well as all of biodiversity, is an extremely spatially explicit one. You really need to know where you are. And so I'm going to get into that in just a second, but the key question here is where in the value chain of the company does a company come close to protected and conserved areas, or what is the state of nature around here. And once one understands that across the entire value chain, one can move on to actual actions to change things on the ground and move into that third phase over here where we're talking about answering the question of how to act. How can I reduce the impact that I may have on protected areas, or support protected areas that I don't have an impact on but I might be close to. Now, I said I'm going to get a little bit more into the spatially explicit approach. So ideally, really, each company location across the value chain of a company would be assessed regarding two different aspects. On one hand, one really needs to understand what does nature look like around that company location. Is there a presence of a protected area, or is it just an area of high conservation value? And then that other aspect is what kind of impacts and dependencies do I have on that protected area? Because if these two things are coming together, it could mean risk for both the company and the protected area as well. If one can see as a company across the entire value chain where these risk and opportunities locations are, one can then move into a response plan to really actively target these areas and effectively drive positive impact on the ground. Now, all of that is, of course, to integrate protected areas ultimately into the corporate sustainability strategy that are then contributing to global goals such as SDGs or the 30 by 30. Of course, it should always start with addressing and reducing the impacts that a company has on nature and protected areas. but it should go beyond that just net zero idea of interacting, and should go one step further in proactively contributing to the restoration of nature. Always keeping in mind that there are lots of co-benefits to be had if one keeps in mind to invest both in a climate positive way and a biodiversity positive way. And all of that is for the ultimate goal for that company to contribute to a nature positive economy going forward. Now, all of that is very theoretical, but we have a great panel assembled that has the practical experience with all of that to back this up. So I'm very, very excited to hand it over to Rebecca for the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Maria. All right, so I might invite our panelists to join us up here right now. We have 3 fascinating speakers joining us today to talk about their on-the-ground experience with the interface between corporates and protected areas, and how contributing to protected areas expansion and management can fit into corporate biodiversity ambitions. So we have Alice Hueza, who's our Africa Region Director for the WWF. Alice, feel free to come join us up here. Alice leads and oversees a regional program and is leading the design of a new conservation framework that brings together work at national, transboundary, and global levels. We have Jamie McCallum. Please come join us as well. Jamie is the founder of Force for Nature and the UK EU Director for the Peace Parks Foundation. And joining us remotely, we have Alexander David. Alex is the head of CSR at Lidl. Thanks to all 3 of you for joining us today. We're very excited to chat. And I think we need a microphone for our in-person panelists. Do you want to take that? Yes, I think maskless is best probably. Yes, otherwise, yeah. Can anyone hear me through this one? That one doesn't seem to be on, but perhaps we can. We might have to pass this one back and forth, actually. I'm not sure about that one. Okay, let's start with Alex while we work out our microphone issues. Alex, can you tell us about... Oh, I think we lost Teams. Maybe we'll start with the in-person questions then. Okay. Oh, we're back. Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay.
Can
Alex,
you hear me too?
Yeah, we can. I think we might have a bit of a delay, but we'll make it work. Alex, can you tell us about Lidl's overall goals and ambitions when it comes to biodiversity?
Well, first of all, let me thank you to participate in today's panel. It's kind of very fascinating of what I've heard already and so far. And I want to start with saying that our overall sustainability strategy focuses on 7 critical action areas, which we identified in a strategy revision process the last 3 years ago. It is climate, water, biodiversity, circular economy, raw materials, human rights, and responsible products, as we call it. And why do I tell you this? Because I think it's important to understand, and I think everybody here agrees to it, that when it comes to biodiversity, that there is a clear and strong connection between the different action areas, for example, climate, water, biodiversity, and also the material usage we have here. From what has been discussed earlier on, it's very clear. And if we look at our biodiversity strategy in detail, it is based on 4 basic principles. First of all, it's understanding the impact we have as a company. What do we contribute to the issue of biodiversity degraded all past years? And what is very funny is that we already developed a biodiversity risk tool, or risk filter, as you call it, because we came up very early and said, hey, how can we measure that? How can we say in which country do we have the biggest risks? Next to identifying the risks, the biggest risks in our assortment. And it's very clear that the fresh fruits and vegetables we have, and also the dairy products, do contribute mostly to biodiversity risks. And for us in this moment, in the first pillar, it's also about retrieving information about our supply chains. Where do, for example, the feed for our dairy products, the animals come from, to clarify that and to see what we can do. The second pillar of our biodiversity strategy is to establish standards addressing these risks. For example, in the soy area, using RTRS certification, palm oil using RTRS, no, not RTRS, RSPO, sorry for that, coffee using existent certifications. But also, which we are very proud of, we want to make conventional farming more biodiversity friendly, let's put it this way, because we can't establish a second kind of biostandard and say, well, that's the way to go, and every supplier from our house has to work according to this. So we develop add-on for the global gap audit or protocol. And this add-on shall encompass criteria for protecting the biodiversity in conventional farming. It may not be kind of the end of the game, but it's kind of a first start of where we're going. We also made some mandatory specifications on pesticide usage and prohibitions, which will come into effect May 22nd. And we're in the midst of establishing by a concept of protecting high value areas where our countries shall then operate to. And the third pillar, for example, is that we want to promote sustainable solutions. So we started in 2016 with the Lidl Soy Initiative. Means we know that we haven't full control yet about the soy which is being fed to the animals, which then kind of come into our product. So we kind of calculated, okay, how much soy do we have indirectly? And we're buying credits for this. And also other stuff. We are increasing the share of vegetarian products and certified organic grown products. And when it comes to, and that's our fourth pillar, initiatives, we want to more and more engage in initiatives in order to kind of do our contribution or make our contribution to systemic change, and it needs collaboration on that. So it's these four pillars our biodiversity strategy is based on.
Great, thank you, Alex. There's a lot of important work happening there. Next, we might shift over to Jamie. Jamie, can you tell us what is Force for Nature, and how do you foster the connection between corporates and protected areas?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks very much indeed, Becca. Probably it's quite a good idea for me to very quickly start by talking about my background for 10 seconds because it's relevant to the question. I spent 10 years working in sports marketing, in sponsorship. So I was working with some of the biggest global brands on global sporting events, everything from football to athletics to Formula One. And of course, that industry is worth nearly $1 trillion a year. And after 10 years in that field, I went and did a PhD in protected area management, and I've spent the last 10 years working for conservation NGOs. And Force for Nature, this latest enterprise, is an effort to try and bring those worlds together. So that instead of relying on philanthropic capital and grant money, which I think we all accept is very valuable, but it's not touching the sides of the funding that we need for protected areas. We're nearly $500 billion short a year in managing the current protected area network. So we need to access private capital, and one solution, not by no means the only one, but one solution is to try to create conservation sponsorship, which matches up with my various skill sets and experience. The key here is that if we can offer value to corporations in terms of their marketing and communications value, access, we can enhance their stakeholder relationships and help them to build a pathway between purpose and profit. Then biodiversity and environmental issues stop being just seen as a threat to neutralize, but they get to start being seen as an opportunity for corporates to build their relationships with their key stakeholders and their businesses, as well as being sustainable into the future. So that value piece is really, really important. And the way we go about it is by delivering plug-in tools. So not just impact, because obviously this doesn't work without real impact on the ground, but that impact is tied to plug-in communication tools so that corporates can reach and enhance their relationships with their different stakeholders. So again, this is all about the opportunities around partnerships in conservation rather than neutralizing the risks. And I think our ambition as an organization is that to bear in mind the simple fact that in 1960, the sports marketing industry was worth, zero or very close to zero. There were a few ticket sales. But there was no sponsorship, there's no broadcast rights, and it's now worth just under $1 trillion a year. And our goal and our aim is that in the future, a lot of that money, or a large proportion of it, will be flowing into conservation. But we have to work hard to think differently to achieve that. The second part of the question is how this relates in our case to protected areas. So the first theme of our pilot project, we're working on a pilot project at the moment, is about protected areas and ranges. And there's a good reason for this, because of course, all around this room we're talking about 30% of the planet protected by 2030, but all too often we're not hearing about the people who have to manage those sites. And we are massively short of the number of frontline conservation staff, rangers. We need at least another 1 million by 2030 around the globe. But so that's the practical reason for choosing rangers as a theme for our first corporate partnership program. But there's another reason, which is that humans tell stories, and rangers can tell stories in their own language about biodiversity in their own country, and which is relevant to their own markets. And storytelling is critical to communication, and communication is critical to sponsorship. So that's a really important piece. But what's I'm just finish up on this question now. What's really important here is that by delivering sponsorship programs around frontline conservation staff, it means that they and their sites are earning money. They're not being granted money, or it's not philanthropic dollars. They're actually earning money because they're the ones who are, through us, but they're the ones who are delivering value to the corporate sector. And therefore, they're earning that money. And it's just a different revenue stream for the protected area rather than grant money. And so that's a really important part of it. But it does require, as I say, a different mindset.
Excellent. No, it's a really interesting new model. Alice, I think there's probably a lot of touch points with your work here. Can you tell us about your program and how private companies play a role?
Thank you very much. Great touch points with our program, and I think the point that you make around the new sources of revenue and is very much important now, especially coming out of the collapse of tourism after COVID-19, and given the role that tourism originally played. We are looking to more and more to diversify those resources. In fact, today we are launching a platform to talk about that. Okay, so let me talk about our work. WWF started in Africa in the 1960s with a campaign to save Africa's rhinos. But since then, the work that we've accomplished, supporting the establishment of protected areas everywhere, supporting effective and equitable management of conserved areas, and improving the welfare of communities, and even the better management of Africa's resources. So we just celebrated 60 years, and we are now starting our new strategy for the next 60 years, and really focusing on two big things. The first one is to continue to really promote this coexistence between people and planet and wildlife and others in one sustainable landscape and seascape. And then really the next one is to make nature everyone's business, really, to engage society, engage every member of society in this. Because I think most of the times you find that this conversation we're having here tends to always happen between the same, amongst ourselves. And we need to bring more people, and some of those are businesses, as we are talking today. So, of course, much has changed since WWF started the work on the continent. Economic trends, population dynamics, infrastructure. We have a lot of infrastructure development, technological advances, increased civic consciousness. Really, in general, Africa wants to grow. Every African country you talk to at the moment wants to become a middle-income country by 2025. So there's a lot of a need to grow, and of course we support that. And the private sector is playing a very, very enormous role in much of this change that is happening in Africa. Some of it positive, but also some of it negative. So the positive side, for example, the private sector's involvement in tourism has created great value for our natural capital. But then we've also had cases where some of the activities like large-scale agriculture, mining and others have degraded those ecosystems that we depend on. For example, in Ghana, we know there are plans to mine bauxite in the Atewa forest, which is a very important forest, an incredibly important site for biodiversity, and also a site that provides fresh water for about 5 million people. In Zambia, there are plans for a commercial agriculture plantation in a game management area, which hosts the world's largest mammal migration. And so we've been actively involved in really advocating for this and opposing this project. And we're excited to see that the private sector has come and joined this. For example, BMW, Tetra Pak, and Shuko all expressed concern about this Atewa, and they also expressed their unwillingness to buy bauxite from such projects. But, we can't tackle these issues one by one. We need solutions at scale. And for us, this means that we also need to create this collective understanding of Africa's natural capital. That's when I talk about an engaged society. But to do that, we also have to understand what is Africa's natural capital. What is it if you want to create that understanding? And recently, we just completed a study with the Boston Consulting Group to look at Africa's green and blue economies to have a very good understanding. And for example, for East Africa, the estimates had like $21 billion just to value that annual impact for East African countries' GDP, and improving the livelihoods of about 26 million people. And these benefits are spread across sustained livelihoods, increased opportunities for jobs, avoided costs, for example, and also preemptive transition to low carbon solutions. So it is crucial for the private sector to understand these values and for people to understand their values. And we know that the finance sector, for example, could prioritize investment opportunities based on the potential impact at the intersection of the economy, which is your GDP, but people for jobs, and environment, the impact of these blue solutions. And of course, we need our national and regional policy leaders to also create the enabling environment for these opportunities to thrive. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alice. Maybe we could pivot back to Alex on teams. Alex, what role do protected and conserved areas play in meeting your biodiversity commitments, whether that's supporting ongoing protection and management, contributing to the expansion of protected areas, or increasing ecological connectivity?
I can only agree to what the previous speakers told and what they have said. It is kind of a journey for the big companies. And if you look at what's happening here in Europe and especially in Germany in the discussions, it's kind of interesting to see that there is kind of a big momentum right now, and it gains more and more momentum for the moment being. So that it's a hot topic of sustainability, and especially these issues about protected areas. At least from my point of view, what we had in the past within Lidl were kind of smaller initiatives from our countries. If you look at Lidl, it's like we are operating in roughly 30 countries worldwide, and we have an international that's where I do work from and we work out the guidelines, the frameworks which the countries have to follow. And if you look at the countries, you have kind of single projects on protecting natural habitats. but there was no kind of framework giving them guidance of what exactly to do and giving them criteria at hand, what to follow. So what I have told before is that in the moment we're in the midst of finishing our guideline on the protection of natural habitats, and this shall be handed over to our countries, and then every country has to decide on what project they want to engage in. They shall protect areas, and it's not that they kind of can choose whatever they want. So, for example, they can choose the grass next to their headquarters. It's about that they have to look at key biodiversity areas, kind of like beautifying the or areas of like conservation value areas, and so on and so on. And once we have that, and we have given this guideline to our countries, they shall come back and tell us what their plan is, so we can kind of make an general and overall goal of what we want to protect in terms of this is the overall sum of area. Next to this, we definitely want to work on more and more on this, the food stuff, the animal feed, which is being used within our supply chains, because we think we have a big leverage here, but it's very complex, very complicated. So we need to have big traders in there, and we also have issues bringing it back to the point of the food source. And again, the third thing, which I already mentioned, is developing the global gap add-on to make the conventional farming of today a bit more biodiversity friendly. I think these issues, they are really really important to us, and we can have um, consideration of high highly conservable or high that's my thought.
Great. No, I think that's a really interesting approach of having this strategic direction, but with local adaptations for sure. That's really interesting. Um, Jamie, how do you find that your work with corporates fits into their overall biodiversity or sustainability strategies?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because our approach is all about a true partnership. So it's not about, as I talked about earlier on, it's not about receiving funding and going off and doing our work. It's about a two-way value partnership. So that means a lot of listening. And you know, it's really good as well just to hear Alex talking about their program. So you think already my mind is whirring. Okay, if that were to be the case, and I was hearing that story, our job is to do a lot of listening and then a lot of supporting of the great work that they're already doing. It's not to lecture to them and tell them what they must do. So in that sense, it's about trying to identify areas and activities that we do with rangers and inside protected areas on a global basis. I mean, we are operating in 85 countries through some of our programs, with thousands of rangers all over the world. So, you know, my question would be, do those align with some of the 30 countries that Alex is talking about? And how could our rangers and our sponsorship program help to support the supply chain challenges and verification and other things that Lidl might be doing around the world? So that's what I mean about this sort of two-way value chain. I mean, I think there's another really key bit here, which is that for our partnerships, that they have to be coherent, you know, and authentic. Because without that, not only does the communication piece of what we're trying to do fall over, and I'll talk about greenwash and the threats of greenwash later on, but obviously that's one of them. So authenticity is like such an important part of this, and the partnership means a two-way trust as well. So it means actually trusting that the partner, you know, the corporate partner, are doing the right things already. They've got their own house in order, and that they're doing their best to improve their performance in all ESG areas. So. But it's about you know, the sort of final punchline really about, you know, how we engage with them is about measurement as well. So ensuring that all measurement of our activities and their activities satisfy their stakeholders, that we can communicate those to their stakeholders in ways that they will understand. There's no point in having some distant ESG measure which has no relevance to any of those stakeholders who they want to communicate with. But obviously they have to be likewise relevant to, to the SDGs or to the IUCN Green List or whatever else it may be. So we have to be measuring those impacts in meaningful ways, but also ways that we can communicate. So it's about several of those different areas.
Great. And maybe this will be my last question to the panel, and then we'll turn over to the audience. But Alice, what more do you think private companies should be doing to support reaching our global goals on protected areas, and where are those key gaps? Hard question, sorry.
Yeah, I know, very hard question. But first, let me recognize that there's been a lot of momentum over the last, decade or so of private sector's involvement. I think globally we are seeing a lot of business for nature. We're seeing really a lot of the private sector has really come to the table. They have. And I think that is important to recognize, the net zero stuff, that's all happening. But interestingly, a lot of that is happening outside of Africa. We're not seeing as much in Africa. And I would like to see the private sector come in and work much more closely with our institutions or whether it's our banks, whatever, and really kind of support that awareness raising and also partnership. I think Jamie, you mentioned the point about it. It is indeed, there has to be a partnership. And then another one, of course, another big point that we always, when you talk to private sector and businesses, you always hear this thing that we really are interested in investing. There's a lot of money, but we can't find those bankable projects, is what they say. We can't find the bankable projects. But the thing is, we need to invest in developing these projects to make them bankable. They are not just going to come from anywhere. Our governments don't have money to, beyond their health demands that they have to deal now with COVID-19, between, trying to create jobs and trying to reduce poverty. They don't always have a lot of money to put aside to incubate these projects and make them bankable. So I would invite the private sector to come in and also prime the pump, yeah? Like come and help make those projects bankable and then invest in them. And we've seen some of those happen in protected areas for sure. There have been some private people coming in and starting something from scratch and building it. In fact, one good example is being launched today, the Gorongosa National Park story. Great example of a private person coming in and really developing that. So more and more of those. We need more and more of those. But I think, so really recognizing, I said earlier, that nature and all of this is everyone's business, because I think there tends to be this thinking about, protected areas, there's a Department of National Parks that's dealing with that, or oceans, there's somebody. But I think the more we can make this everyone's business, the more we can make everyone realize that if that protected area goes away, it's actually going to affect me here, even though I look like I'm a million distant. Yeah, I think if we can do that, the Congo Basin, perfect example. The lungs, it may be sitting in Africa, but its importance to the world, it's almost like it's a second Amazon, right? So we should all then be invested in protecting the Congo Basin. We should all be there. We should all be, not just leave it to the African governments, but so maybe to mention a couple of examples also. So I mentioned earlier tourism. Tourism has been one of those places where the private sector has played a big role, and it is important to really recognize that when you bring money for tourism, you don't just benefit that area only. You benefit the communities that are living around that area. Their livelihoods depend on this. There's a study that was done on $1 that for tourism and how it creates $14 elsewhere. Because that money goes into national budgets, it pays for education, it pays for health. It's important. So that's true. And the fact that it has collapsed, and the fact that we're looking to really recover, means that we can now really invite the private sector to pay more and help us diversify this model of tourism that has previously depended mostly on tourists coming in. And so some of the points that I think Jamie was making around diversifying that. The private sector, of course, can play a role in sourcing, maybe sourcing products, making sure that you're sourcing the right things. For example, a good example here is, of course, we know that wild plants provide a vast array of medicals. And we've seen like Fair Wild certified baobab from Zimbabwe, which is now traded internationally and bringing their communities there. So I think there's a lot that the private sector can do, and I've mentioned some of those points. But I think most importantly, we need to really engage the public and private sector and social sector. We need to create that enabling environment, and we need to partner and bring everybody and make it everybody's business. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. A lot of important work ahead of us for sure. I think we may have time now for 1 to 2 questions from the audience. If we could also bring our virtual participants back up, just in case there's questions for them, that would be great. And I'll hand over to Maria.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, thank you to all of our panelists for such a great overview of the practical aspects of that connection. And I would ask the audience that is attending here if there are any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, just raise your hands and I can come over with the microphone. Yeah, fantastic.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So my first question for all 3 speakers would be, what motivates companies to engage in these processes and to actually make this active contribution to biodiversity? And then to our speaker from Lidl, more specifically, you mentioned that you're also engaging in systemic change. So that kind of makes me think about regulation. Do you see a role for regulation to actually help you in your efforts, for example, by creating a more level playing field? And then this would also be a question for the other 2 speakers, but mainly addressed to Lidl and also getting a better understanding of what you meant by a systemic change. Super, thank you.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll go ahead. As far as I understand it, most of it is we. When it comes to systemic change, we are in the midst of identifying the right initiatives where to engage in. And as my previous speakers told, like Alice and Jamie, it is important to partnership with all the actors within the supply chain where it comes to really kind of big impacts within the supply chain. So, and if you take a close look at our supply chains, for example, because we know conventional farming, for example, is not good. But when you look at banana farmers from Colombia, which deliver into our supply chains, it's alone 3,000 companies out there. It's way too much if you look at all the other suppliers we have, because if you look at our assortment, to engage with everybody else. So we are looking for ways of how to engage it really. And if I say systemic, we also have to look at Lidl, at the complexity of our supply chains, and think about what can we do systemically in order that our climates will be effective in the end at the field, and will really do change things for the better, and in the end be nature positive, for example. But I think that's a long way to go if you take that into account. And if you look at, for example, our supply chains out of Europe for fresh fruits and vegetables, we have roughly about 70,000 farmers we know of, which deliver to us, and we do not know each single farmer yet. So it's still a lot of work to do and to go into there and be on the ground. And that's one of the big issues here, complexity and finding the real lever in order to kind of make the change happen. And we can tell a lot, but we engage a lot within the field. And what we want to avoid is we want to give out a goal and cannot fulfill on it. So we are very cautious about what we're committing to, because we know how much effort there is in there. And that's the reason we came up with a kind of a risk tool or a risk filter in order to see where do we have to look at first and then go into later, because that's what you need to do. So does this help for the systemic change? And of course, a regulation would help a lot. But if you look at the international conventions out there, it's kind of also interesting that there is a weak enforcement nationally in some parts of the world. And if there could be some kind of assistance by bigger countries in order to address that. In order to set up a level playing field, it might help and it could help.
Thank you, Alex. It would be amazing to hear from all of our panelists on this, but unfortunately we have another session starting in this space in 1 minute. So many thanks to everyone for joining us today. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I think we've touched on a lot of important issues. We can definitely see some clear themes emerging from all of these different perspectives. We heard about the importance of developing new models and making sure that protected areas are everyone's business. We heard about engaging local communities for appropriate solutions, and also really critically making sure that we communicate the value and the opportunities of doing this kind of work. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to our audience. Keep an eye out for upcoming work from our stewardship team on biodiversity risks and opportunities. We're doing a lot of exciting things, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Bye.